Relax and watch this video, Women, Freedoms and Her Story, which amplifies the voices of selected women that have participated in the movement, either as individual activists, as part of organizations, or even as part of the mainstream civil society, as they reflect on and share their views on what are some of the key successes of the women's movement, what are some of the key notable failures, what are the lessons learned, and they also make recommendations to inform future activities by the women's movement. As we invite you to walk with us the journey of listening to these women speak, we also would want to share that this selection of these particular women does not by any means mean that they're the only actors in the women's movement. Their views also do not reflect the views of the wider women's movement, but give us a snippet of some of the issues that we need to think about as we reflect on the women's movement. We all know that in our individual ways, the women of Zimbabwe and the girls of Zimbabwe have contributed to what is known as the women's movement, and it is our hope that this video adds to the body of knowledge around the issue of women, freedoms and her story.
Okay. My name is Murewa, and I'm a member of the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe. I have been a member right from inception. When we started off, it was a loose coalition. We would rally together for an issue, deal with it and disperse. But with time, we decided to formalize it and to become an entity with a secretariat. Women's Coalition has done a lot of work. We've had our successes, our failures. The coalition was formed so that it provides a safe space for lobbying and advocating for issues to do with women's rights. And it gave safety, and it also it strengthened the women's movement in Zimbabwe. So when we talk success, we have cases like when we pushed for women's inheritance issues, for example. We had the case, the Magai and Magaya case, where women were disadvantaged in terms of inheritance because of the cultural practices. We rallied together, pushed for that, and it resulted in the inheritance laws that we have today. We also came together for the constitutional reform processes in the year 2000, and also for the current constitution. We actively participated in that process. We engaged women. We had women's contributions. We put them together and we presented those issues to the process. In terms of failures, we have had some attempts to implement programs, and that did not work very well. Women's Coalition is an umbrella body. Now, if an umbrella body now tries to implement programs, it seems like it's competing with the members. So that did not go well with the members, and it did not work out well. The good thing is that we quickly realized that, so things have been sorted. So it still remains just as an umbrella body. We made an attempt for the Women's Coalition to be a fund manager with funds, hoping to get funds through the UN Women. That process made us realize that we are not ready. We did not have adequate systems in place. We did not have adequate staff. So the whole process fell through. In terms of recommendations, I would recommend that the coalition remains as it is, as an umbrella body, as a rallying point for women's organizations. I would also recommend that the coalition takes lead. When we are together, it takes lead in pushing for the women's agenda. The third recommendation I would make is that they should just continually mobilize for membership. Membership drive is key to the success of the coalition. Membership in terms of organizations and membership in terms of individual members, individual women activists. That way, numbers will strengthen the women's coalition work. Because with few members, then it means that the reach is also reduced. So I would actually really emphasize that we need to increase our membership. Thank you.
The women's movement has a rich history because without it, there would really be no discussions or no prioritization of gender equality or women's rights in Zimbabwe. So what really stands out as some of the key successes of the women's movement in this country is the changes in legislation. You know, we are now adults, we are no longer legal minors because legislation has changed. We now have protection from domestic violence because legislation has changed. None of those victories would have happened without the women's movement having been involved, including at the policy level. There is no way that we would have had the kind of gender policy that is responsive to our issues right now if there wasn't a push and impact, you know, from the women's movement. Of course, you know, with the successes come a lot of challenges because the two kind of mutually reinforce each other. You go 10 steps forward and sometimes you take 2 steps back because the challenges are there. So, for example, we've got a wonderful constitution now which was adopted in 2013, but what is missing really is the extent to which the women's movement has really run with the constitution in order to popularize it for our sisters who are in those remote corners of the country. It is very important to decentralize women's rights movement building so that it is not contained within, you know, smaller groupings of organized interest groups such as NGOs. We need our sisters, you know, Murewa. So we need to do more in organizing at the grassroots level, you know, so that we have a much more, a bigger critical mass that is going to, you know, push the agenda. I think also it is important for us to appreciate the fact that, you know, formal equality which you find in documents, yeah, such as a policy or such as the constitution, need to be operationalized. We are seeing a gap between the formal rights that we have on paper and what is happening on the ground. And I think the women's movement need to do much more to push to make sure that we close the gap between the formal rights that we have and the commitments that we find on paper and what is actually happening on the ground. And therefore, in terms of how we move forward, we need to consolidate ourselves as a women's movement. We need to make sure that grassroots-based women and women who are at different levels are connected and we have a shared agenda. We did that with respect to the constitution, the reform of our constitution in 2013. We can do it again. Secondly, we need to make sure that we play our role in a very, very proactive way to make sure that the rights in our constitution become a reality for every woman. So we need to play our role in popularizing our constitution and making sure that the constitution works for every woman in the country. And then thirdly, we need to really push and fight for resources to finance women's rights work and to finance gender equality initiatives. There's just very little money to go around in order to push our agenda. So we need to do much more to push for, you know, adequate financing.
I'm Murewa from Disabled Women Support Organization, being the executive director. We work with women and girls with a disability. We work in all the 10 provinces of Zimbabwe. The women's movement has made big achievements. We look at the 50-50, it's the women's movement. When we look at the women's movement, looking at the women with disabilities, we find out that they've made really a great achievement. We start with the Disability Act which was a 1992 Disability Act. It was from the disability movement. And we look at the constitution again. Women with a disability participated also, and they also they gained something from the new constitution. We found out we were not even recognized, but now we have got a senator. We are trying to push for more seats in parliament. We look at it as an achievement. That is something which we have gained. And we look at the inclusive education. All those, they came from the movement. We look at issues of accessibility, the infrastructure. You find out that in some institutions, the policies have changed, that they say all buildings should be accessible to people with disabilities. And the other achievement which we made is in the constitution, that sign language is now a language which is recognized, because long back it was not even recognized. For us, it's an achievement. We also look at women with disabilities. We find that there are some women with disabilities now who, though it is just a small percentage, who are now leading other institutions. The UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it was a push from the movement that the president signed and ratified that convention. And as we speak now, we are looking at the alignment of the Disability Act and the new constitution. As the women with the disability movement, we have also come up with a position paper. We are in the process of coming up with that position paper. We have already met, and we are in that process of coming up with that position paper. For us, it's an achievement, because long back we couldn't even be heard or recognize that we are there.
Yeah, I think the women's movement is so fragmented, and it has become an elitist movement where that involves a certain grouping of women, the so-called educated women, and which has left out women from the grassroots, and as that has resulted in issues not being really discussed effectively, because the women that they are representing are completely left out. So, and the other problem is that the women heading this, the various women's movement NGOs, speaking from experience, for example, if you want a comment over some story, if the director is not there, it means there's no comment from that organization, and they are not proactive when it comes to issues pertaining to women in our society. We've had women get beaten in their homes, killed by their spouses, and vice versa, men being killed by their spouses, and we never get to hear what these women say or comment about such issues. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no women's movement in Zimbabwe, because I have not heard their voices in a very long time. The women's movement I remember, or I have memories of, was the one that existed soon after independence. It was beautiful. It campaigned for women's rights, legal age of majority act, and so many other issues. But today, frankly speaking, there's nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Mostly women in the electoral processes have been the majority to vote. Mostly they have been there to sustain the failing economies of our countries. So I think what have been successful is that we have begun to see women across generations, across sectors, being the support system that have kept development going and that have sustained or that have mitigated even in times of disasters. So in terms of challenges, the context have continuously changed in a way where the investment in the women's movement in terms of resources have been project-based and not looking at women's rights from a life cycle approach. So this have resulted in challenges that women's movement have been under-resourced for the work that it has been doing, and this have affected or limited the reach. And looking at how the women's movement have also positioned itself in the mainstream civil society spaces and collective institutions and social movements, we have seen that mostly women have been there. But what have been challenging is just the mechanisms, the tools, the institutional and structural reforms that will enable that as women exist in different shades of power, in different structures of the society, how do they keep the momentum of being accountable to the women's rights agenda? My recommendations would be that we need to acknowledge that there have been knowledge that have been accumulated over time, over generations. We need to have a continuous process of embracing that knowledge that women have gained by doing, by experience. And we need to continue creating a conducive environment for the rights realization through us also interrogating the institutions that should facilitate for the implementation of laws, policies, and anything, pronunciations, even at regional and global level that speaks to issues around women's rights and gender equality. What is the cost of implementing them? What structural reforms need to be put in place? How do we pay attention to issues sometimes of term of office? Because don't we also want to create different layers for women who are leaders? Why do they become so static that those that may be aspiring, the roles that they are playing, they also evolve to higher levels of opportunities and power, and also create space for others who are emerging? And how do we also get to a point that we have a continuous process that looks at women's rights from a life cycle approach, not a project-based support? So one of the other things is also mechanisms around strengthening our local philanthropy, to say how do we also fund our own revolution and invest in our resources and paying it forward for those that have benefited from privileges that have come before. So currently, I think the current context also come in at a point where we have issues around the corporate capture of the state and the corporate capture of the donor environment, where sometimes the economic empowerment models that are coming to women are capitalistic in nature in a manner that does not empower them but keep them busy to put food on the table for a day but keep them poor for the rest of their life. So I think some of the recommendations I would put in is around investing in learning around how do we sustain the momentum of the women's movement, how do we deconstruct issues of ideology in terms of us sticking to feminist principles, how do we also hold each other accountable, and how do we coexist in the diversity nature of who we are as a collective.
My name is Achilles Felaningoma. I'm currently serving at Women in Politics Support Unit. I think that the women's movement has had major successes in moving rights and the status of women forward over several years. But I think, speaking from a women's political participation perspective, I think certainly we would be remiss to not see the role that was played by the women's movement broadly in trying to raise and create things such as the SADC Protocol on women, gender and development, which of course then led to the SADC Declaration, and it became the first regional document to actually set a quota for women's political participation. And I think the women's movement, the way that they operated within Zimbabwe in particular, took leadership that created space within the regional space to ensure that that desire to have, set standards for women's representation got adopted formally within the SADC space. And it wouldn't have happened without having key women within political parties, working with women who were outside in the women's rights organizations, working with women who were activists, and also working with sisters who are sitting in regional institutions and regional spaces, working also with sisters who were in the women's movement, who are sitting in different countries within the SADC region, who were able to create a critical mass to develop a push for a legal instrument that in 1997 became, a formal legal instrument guiding women's representation in the region. And I think what has been interesting has been seeing it manifest itself in the different regional countries, and in particular in Zimbabwe, beginning to see how having that document galvanized the idea of voluntary party quotas, which were incredibly critical in beginning to drive a language of parity in participation and to secure it with not just a rights-based just as a rights-based demand, but as a legal obligation within the country. And I think it is without a doubt one of the most powerful things that led to our current constitution, which has section 17 on gender parity, that's got section 80 on the rights of women, that's got section 56 that speaks very, very clearly and prescriptively about what we expect to see in terms of the representation of women in our society. I think that was an incredible way, the way that women worked.
My name is Gladys Changachirere. I work with the Institute of Young Women Development, which is an organization that's working to promote the participation of young women and girls in decision-making, policy-making, and other political processes. In my line of work, I have noted that there are a number of successes that the Zimbabwean women's movement has made, which we are now riding upon as an organization working for women's rights. Two key things that I need to talk about. Number one is the fact that they have been able to actually push for laws that acknowledge the rights of women and girls in Zimbabwe, laws with which we are now able to structure the work that we are doing around and actually push for the implementation in respect of such laws. Then number two, I think the women's movement has also done great in terms of creating feminist knowledge and tools, most of which we are now using in the work that we are doing, where we do not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but perhaps just to look at the existence of that body of knowledge and say, how can we apply that knowledge in the current context, where we also now have other new technologies that could actually enhance, work around women and girls' rights. Those are two key things that I really appreciate and I see as successes by the Zimbabwean women's movement. Then in terms of failures, I think sometimes I feel that there hasn't been that smooth transition and connection amongst women of different generations, to the extent that some of the women or young women who emerge or other women's rights organizations that emerge are actually forced to sometimes, go an extra mile to try and see, so who were the other women who were there before us that we can look up to, that we can tap onto in terms of experience, in terms of knowledge, and also that we can still maintain within the current women's movement, so that, we are able to continue with an intergenerational dialogue around women's rights. And of course, I acknowledge the fact that, movements sometimes are time bound, and there is a group of women or a generation of women that can at one point come in and do this work and move on. And sometimes it's really difficult to see those women through the entire, generations of women. But I think there should be a deliberate mechanism within women's organizations or within the women's movement to ensure that there is that intergenerational connection, where we're still able to learn from each other, share with each other, in order to advance the women's rights agenda. So in terms of recommendations, this is where I feel that I think we need to do more in terms of connecting the different generation of women and organizations that are working on women's rights, so that there's, continuous passage and transfer of knowledge and also even experiences, because sometimes we then end up seeing organizations or new activists having to reinvent the wheel when it's already done. So if we're able to actually, have a mechanism with which we can connect women of different generations, I think that can do a lot in terms of not necessarily duplicating the work, but rather focusing the work where it needs to be done in order to take it forward.
I'm 38 years old. I'm a gender activist and believe in feminism. I'm currently the programs manager for Center for Natural Resource Governance, CNRG, which advocates for the rights of women, youth, and artisanal miners, especially in the mining sector. But prior to my engagement at CNRG, I've been involved in the women's movement as a member of the Women's Coalition, and also I have been active in the processes around promoting economic justice under Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development. In terms of the successes of the women's movement as a whole, I should say that I came into the women's movement in late 2003 when Women's Coalition was being chaired by Jana Ncube at that time, and I admired the strength in the collectiveness of the women across the country on the need to come up with a law that protects women from domestic violence. At that time, I should say that from 2003 up to around 2007, 2008, there was that collectiveness among the women's rights organizations. There was the desire to see change, and this shouldn't be divorced from the current political developments that were taking place during that time, where the opposition parties were coming strong with reference to the MDCT and the need to be able to link the economic justice and the political and social agenda as well. And at that time, the donor community, the funding partners, were also supporting the women's rights agenda in terms of ensuring that the women were able to voice their concerns, not only around issues of enactment of the domestic violence, but also to ensure that the electoral process is engendered with reference to the 2008 elections, especially with the 27 June 2008 elections, which saw a number of women who were violated by the state security, who received shelter from the Women's Coalition and among its other members as well. I should say that in terms of the failures, but I can't say it's a failure. This is beyond the women's movement's control. When you look at the time when the economy was going down, as from 2007 up to 2010, 2013, we saw a huge exodus of seasoned women's rights activists who were now going to the diaspora, who had left a trail of successes in the women's movement from the 80s, from the 90s, even in the early 2000s. I feel that the women's movement did not do much in terms of joining forces, in terms of linking up with the seasoned activists that were in the diaspora, despite the fact that there were some organizations who were doing it on an individual basis. But I should have hoped that there should have been that collective effort to ensure that the new generation of young women activists that come through do not have to repeat the same mistakes that the older generation of feminists and women's rights activists had gone through. So that kind of disjointed collaboration with the women from the diaspora as well as the women in Zimbabwe, I feel that that was a loss, which I'm hoping that now, as we're looking forward towards 2018, there's now that collaborative effort for women's rights activists and the broader women's movement to even work with the women's rights activists that are now in government, that are now in state institutions such as the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, to ensure that they are also form those kinds of alliances and to ensure that the women's agenda remain relevant within the political dispensation. And it is important that even within the Human Rights Commission, we have some seasoned women's rights activists who are our allies in those spaces. But now the key issue is to say, given the dwindling economy, given the fact that the global recession in 2008, that has affected the funding for women's rights organizations, not only in Zimbabwe, but the rest of the global south. How do we then come together with all our diversity and all our differences and ensure that we come together and speak with one voice, especially on areas that relate to addressing issues of political violence, in terms of creating economic opportunities for women to be able to thrive and be able to look after their families.
My name is Memory Pamela Kadam. I'm a mom. I am a sister. I'm an activist. The women's movement in Zimbabwe, it's something that formed and shaped my activism as I was growing up. I started knowing about the women's movement in Zimbabwe when I was in high school. And the first organizations that I knew of was the Women's Action Group and the Women's Coalition. And the good work that they were doing in terms of pushing for justice and equality and representing the rights of women. And I think at that time there was so much criticism and so much criticism from women themselves, from men themselves, about just women organizing themselves and speaking about equality, speaking about the rights of women, speaking about sexual health and reproductive rights. And these women were talking about something that we're not learning at school. So I was captivated by the work that they were doing at that time. And I think that it defined the woman that I am today, that they provided a role model, that I also can speak about equality. I also can stand up for my rights. The other success of the women's movement, I think, is the work that they did. By then I was now active in civil society. The height of organization of the women's movement during the constitution making process, where the women's movement in Zimbabwe came together with the broader civil society and pushed for equality and women's issues to be incorporated in the new constitution that we have now. And more importantly, they pushed for the quota system. What we also need to note is the Domestic Violence Act, which was a result of the work of the women's movement in Zimbabwe, the gender policy, the recent landmark child marriages ruling that was made last year around child marriages. What can I say? I don't think I can really call them failures, maybe shortcomings of the women's movement. And my biggest frustration was the lack of documentation. Because all this work that I'm talking about and all the successes that I'm talking about, it's because I have had an intimate relationship with the women's movement in Zimbabwe. But I'm thinking about my sister that is not in civil society, that doesn't know anything about different organizations in the women's movement in Zimbabwe. If she can get literature around the work that the women's movement is doing. And there's a saying that I like, that until the lion learns to write, the stories will always glorify the hunter. So as women, I think we need to improve documentation. We need to also recognize the warriors and heroes of our time, of our struggle. I think the solidarity work needs to continue. We need to stand together and continue pushing for the women's rights agenda. We need to continue doing advocacy work and pushing for justice and equality in our society, in our communities, in our workplaces. The other recommendation is the connection with the women in rural areas. We need to continue doing that work. We need to continue upscaling that work because it is important to continue going to communities, raising awareness. My last recommendation to the women's movement is the need for continued work on broad alliances with other organized groups and movement because that is critical in terms of pushing for gender equality. We cannot continue operating in small pockets or fragmented. In order for us to transform societies, we need to develop or make those alliances and push for the gender equality agenda.
My name is Rita Nyampinga. I'm the Director of Female Prisoner Support Trust. I've been working with the Women's Coalition since its inception, when women gathered in 1999 to form around the Constitution. That was a major success for women in Zimbabwe because they managed to organize themselves to to work on the constitution, on the referendum of 2000. And since then, they haven't moved back. But the failure that we have is to have a really grassroots connected movement. We are fragmenting again because of the politics of the day, because of bad governance in Zimbabwe as a country. And our activism is at different levels, because there are some activists who, if there is no money, they don't want to take part. And we've got other activists who can go out of their way and do anything, as long as it is defending the space, defending the rights of women, defending the rights of the people of Zimbabwe. Recommendation is that we should meet regularly and update and also participate in developmental issues of the country, because we are 52% of the women in our population. So we must be seen and our voices should be heard.
The different parts or the different players in the women's movement in Zimbabwe have done a lot of work over the years, going back 80 years. And this has been with mixed results. So now we do have the Constitution of Zimbabwe, which outlaws discrimination, which affirms gender equality, which even goes further and specifies the rights of groups of women. This is useful in that over the years, part of the struggles for the women's movement have been to be able to take those issues lived by women, by girls, and really deal with them in a way that does not compromise anyone. So the legislative framework is very good. What do I mean by legislative framework? I'm saying that we have the Constitution, which is positive. We also have a set of laws that were crafted in response to identified challenges, particularly in the area of personal and family issues. And then we also have even policies. But this brings me to the point that I want to raise around what the challenges are. A lot of advocacy has gone, or a lot of work to influence leaders has gone into getting the right kind of language in our laws, in the legislative framework. But we still have a big challenge of translating the aspirations of these instruments to address those concerns that are faced by women. The only thing that is very disappointing for a woman is having a constitution that promises you something, and then when you seek to demand or when you seek to exercise what the constitution says, you find that it's very difficult. So one challenge that remains for the women's movement, or for the players in the women's movement in Zimbabwe, is to be able to really get those that have the power to deliver as they are supposed to. So as much as we are focused as women organizations, as individual activists, as individuals working within mainstream organizations or within government, as much as we are focused on getting women to understand what their rights are, and we continue to focus on that, we now need a bigger strategy, or a better strategy, a more effective strategy on dealing with the leaders or with the duty bearers, so that they're also responsive to the laws that they've adopted. So one challenge is that we need to ensure that we start counting the gains. We start counting the number of women that are actually benefiting from the maintenance laws, that are actually benefiting from the laws of inheritance, that are actually benefiting from the laws that guarantee parity in education, that are actually benefiting from or being protected by the Anti-Domestic Violence Act. What have been some of the lessons learned? A lot of energy is put into determining whether the movement exists or doesn't exist. And for me, as an individual, as long as we have some entities or some people that are working together to highlight the issues of concern for women, I do believe that the movement exists. We may want to then go down and define the disparate entities that make up this movement, but for me,
there is merit in actually having diverse groupings of people speaking the same language. As long as we have agreement as women of Zimbabwe that there is oppression of women or too much power over women in Zimbabwe, and we need to actually be addressing that, for me it is enough. How we address it, usually we put a lot of energy into trying to criticize how individually we address it. But I come from a school of thought that says the more strategies we use, the better. When one strategy does not work, the other one will work.
My name is Audrey Charama, and I'm a communications specialist. I really believe in telling the women's story. I have been in the women's movement for almost 2 decades now, and one of the key issues that we've noted is that we don't tell our story. And whenever we try to tell what is happening to us, often we are asked from what lens. But we are saying, as women working within the women's space area, we need to be able to tell our experience, celebrate our achievements, and articulate the challenges that we face in the different spaces and say, how best can we reach out to each other? I think the major challenge has been that while women are aware that we have pretty much the same story in terms of the challenges, in terms of the need to celebrate each other and celebrate ourselves, we are not able to adequately and appropriately connect the dots most of the time. And it is imperative that we connect those dots. Now, we can only connect these dots through networking, just like a web. A web is made up of all these lines and all these nets from the different type of weaving. We need the women's stories being told. If it be women who are living with HIV, if it be women who have been survivors of gender-based violence, if it be women who have been marginalized in terms of accessing resources. And we know we have borne the brunt of really every situation because we are women. Yet we are the ones that can actually build peace. We are the peacemakers, and we are the active participants in society. We should actually be articulating where it is that we are going, and we should be dictating the pace of society. I think one of the major challenges we have is trying to address cultural issues from a gender paradigm or using a gender lens. We need to continually do that, continually dialogue, continually see which of the cultural practices, values and norms need to be done away with, or how women abuse or gender-based violence is being accentuated in the group of culture. We need to go back under those trees and articulate, have those cultural dialogues and say, where is it that we have missed it? How is it that we can make this right? And begin to document, because we have lost a lot of indigenous knowledge which could have actually helped us move forward. And without actually amplifying the women's voices, we are doing nothing.
My name is Lydia Majigira Panzi. I work for the Forum for African Women Educationalists Zimbabwe chapter, an organization that works to address gender disparities in education. I think basically the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe and the women's movement in general has really done a lot in terms of bringing together women from all walks of life to discuss issues that affect women. When policy pronouncements are done, when national issues are being discussed, I think the women's movement in general has provided that platform and space for women to really sit and talk, deliberate, so that women's issues are included in whatever discussions that are being done at national level. And so for me, that's a commendable job, and that's a success in the work that the women's movement is doing. And going forward, I would recommend that we do a lot of documenting the work that we are doing. There's a lot of work that is being done at grassroots level, provincial, district level, and so I recommend that a lot of effort be put, a lot of resources in documenting stories, documenting programs about the work that is being done in the women's movement. Thank you.
Edna Masiwa. I'm the Executive Director for the Women's Action Group. I also was a contributor to this book that has been launched today. I wrote the story of Women's Action Group. For the women's movement in Zimbabwe, I think our key success has been the ability to bring women's issues to the fore. I'm sure you are aware that people are now speaking about gender and how it affects women and girls. And I think this is all because of the women's movement that started then. We are speaking of 80 years before, but I think it's even more than the 8 years we are speaking to. Currently, we are being faced with challenges which are mainly related to the socio-economic environment, where as organizations we are no longer able to organize women for a cause. We also faced with so many challenges that are affecting women. Take for example, we have issues of HIV, we have issues of maternal mortality, and many other issues that also are negating the gains which we had made as a women's movement. So for the women's movement, what I recommend that we do is we go back to the planning, to the drawing board. We look at our issues that are affecting us and work together despite the socio-economic challenges we are facing.
My name is Murewa. I'm the director of Zimbabwe Women's Bureau, but I'm the current or the sitting vice chairperson of the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe. Some of the successes of the Women's Coalition since I joined the movement is that the Women's Coalition has managed to mobilize members across the nation. We are a national organization which mobilizes members even to the grassroots level, as showcased by its structures that go even to the chapters who are grassroots represented, who represent the grassroots women. We also have a thematic representation, which is very key because in most cases when you come together, there are issues there are diverse issues that need to be addressed, and when you put yourselves into thematic areas, it makes you address most of the issues with justice. For example, we have the economic cluster, the legal and constitutional cluster. I'm just mentioning a few. There are 9 clusters that we have, and women are rallying behind those issues and making sure that all the issues around women are addressed. One of the successes as well is about the issue of the constitutional making. As a movement, we are one lobby group that has managed to change a lot in terms of issues of the constitution pertaining women. There were so many people who were lobbying for the issues, for example, the youths, the political parties, and so many other groups. But as the Women's Coalition, we feel we did quite a lot in bringing in quite a lot of women's rights issues within the coalition and turning around the tables in terms of issues to do with women's rights issues. Some of the challenges that we face are that we still need to grow to the extent of being able to own our own property and be permanent on that property. So it needs support in terms of finding resources making us mobilize resources around that. And I recommend that we showcase ourselves more with the development partners and also reach out more to the grassroots, going down to the grassroots more as we do our work, and also make use of the structures that we have. We need to make use of the structure that we have, that is the chapters and all, to be reaching out to the various grassroots communities.
communities that we are working with. We also need regional and international interface so that we strengthen the movement, and we need to do more on that. We know we have been doing quite a lot around that, working around issues to do with protocols and all, but I think we need to strengthen and do more to do with that, and also encourage implementation of those rather than just having the documents. But we also need to put pressure on the implementation of the various protocols at that level.
Nancy Kachingwe. The women's movement has made Zimbabwe one of the countries with probably the most progressive legislation and policy around women's rights. And generally, in terms of gender equality statistics, Zimbabwe is probably a leading country in terms of literacy, women's political participation, women's participation in public life, in private life. Yeah, we have done, through the activism and the struggles, we have probably put Zimbabwe quite ahead of the pack on women's rights, I'm proud to say. I think that we should build on our successes and aim to play a bigger leadership role in the affairs of the country. I think too many things are left to men to do still in terms of leading Zimbabwe forward, and so I think as women's organizations and women's movements and as women, we should now be bold and take our place at the forefront of taking Zimbabwe forward.
My name is Jean Mandeo. That's in terms of networking and getting women together to come and talk together as one voice. And I remember in the 90s and 2000s, when there was the land issue, the women's movement, women's organizations got the women from the rural areas and they came together to give their voices in the local languages to the Land Commission that was run by Professor Rukuni. Also, when we had the issue of the Venya Magaya case, the women's movement, they came together and tried to sort of address Venya issues on the issue of inheritance. But again, because we live in a patriarchal society, it was women organized, mobilized. But the nature of our society in terms of the patriarchy and all that, Venya died of a heart attack because heartbreak actually, because the house was given to a brother because of the law. And then the other issues, the Women's Coalition, the issue of the Constitution, that was a success. And the other issue, the Domestic Violence Act of 2007, the women's movement mobilized via Musasa Project and Zimbabwe Women's Lawyers Association. That was a beautiful working together of the women, working together with the Ministry of Women's Affairs, Ministry of Justice, and so on. Notable failures. The women's movement has been accused of being urban. That's the perception that people have all over. Even today, people say they are urban based. The women's movement is right now, people are not coming together to rally around the issues. Like, for example, we've had this issue of this 9-year-old girl. Very soon people will be attacking. Where are the women? Where is the women's movement? They're supposed to be advocating for these issues, not just as individuals, but all of us together. The reason for that, I think it's because of lack of finances, lack of funding. But we can mobilize. The little that we have, come together and do something, have our voices heard, write articles and so on. Way forward. Yeah, way forward. I've been working in the area of information. The information there's a lot of information that has been written by the women's movements, documented. And that information is not available. People need to use that information so that they know that the women's movement has done some work in the past. And it's still going ahead doing things, although on a limited scale at the moment. But like this book that we launched today, that is the start of documenting. But we need to, women's movement probably, people have been saying women's university, yes, should try and come up with archives, approach all the women's organizations. Yeah, we need to put our information in digital form so that people all over the world, including in Zimbabwe, access that information, because right now it's not accessible. And yet we've had the Western organizations, Library of Congress, they would come here and get information, and that information at Library of Congress is available, which we don't have here on our own. So the most important thing that we should do as a women's movement is to document. We've already started the process of documenting. We should go ahead, but even put it in the different formats, like what has been suggested. That is key. Especially that information can be used for teaching purposes. And it's, yeah, I think that's all I can say.
My name is Talent Juma. I work with an organization called Katso Sisterhood. Our focus area is young women and girls, sexual and reproductive health and rights. And our strategy is movement building. So we basically go into communities, support young women to start telling their stories and experiences. And then we support them to analyze the experiences. And in many cases, a lot of cases of injustices, oppressions begin to emerge. And then we further support them to advocate around issues of concern. We basically believe that every woman has a story to tell, but they also have the power within themselves to tackle the issues that they're faced with. So we believe our agenda is about empowering women to find their voices so that they speak out against different forms of violence at different levels. So if you're in a community, if you're in Rusape, the duty bearers in Rusape who should ensure that a girl or a young woman can access services, health services for example. And it is important for us to support women in the same community to identify issues of concern and be able to act on them. So supporting women to find their power, their voices is part of our core agenda, and we are very happy because this work we don't do in isolation. We are part of the broader women's movement, and I want to celebrate the fact that we've attained a lot of gains through collaboration, through collaborative work. I can recall just a few years back we protested against rape and sexual violence, and in particular I want to quote the experience where one leader, church leader, was convicted, and we felt that we had to do something because they were going to appeal the sentence. And we came together as a women's movement to say we were done seeing perpetrators of sexual violence being let off the hook. We mobilized through the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe, petitioned, the Ministry of Justice, and it was impossible for the Ministry of Justice to even, try and be more lenient with the perpetrator. And many cases we've come together to advocate through the Women's Coalition of Zimbabwe. I can talk about cases where young women were being stripped naked in town, in the city center, specifically in my metropolitan cities, Harare, Bulawayo. We came together as a movement, organized protests, went into the streets. We were saying we are reclaiming our streets. And I believe that we were only able to do this because we're working as a collective, because our voices were amplified. It was not a one-woman struggle. It was about bringing, different voices, young women from diverse backgrounds, women who are more experienced into the space, so that we could tackle these issues of violence that was targeted at young women in our cities. I believe that as a women's sector, we do implement a lot of initiatives at different levels. We are in Bire, we are in Chiredzi, we are in Dzivarasekwa. People are implementing a lot of development programs, advocacy initiatives in different parts of the country, hard to reach communities where the road infrastructure is bad. But I've seen women's organizations go to those communities, target those communities where we face with constraints. The roads are bad, and in many cases we don't have vehicles that can easily navigate those roads, but we've done our best. And my recommendation, it's actually an appeal to our supporters out there, specifically our government, the donor community, is to actually ensure that in financing development work, that they may focus more on women's organizations, women-led initiatives that will actually reach out to that young girl, that woman in that area which is regarded as hard to reach, because their lives, those lives matter, their voices matter, and they also should be able to access their constitutional rights. So the issue of availing resources for that work is very, very critical. It's urgent, and we cannot keep postponing, because the issue of poor road infrastructure is being used as an excuse. But for how long shall we postpone? We just need to push so that those people who are in charge of resource allocation, implementation of programs, can prioritize these women who are located in those hard-to-reach communities. For us to be able to tell our stories, today we're just celebrating the launch of a journal by the Women's Coalition, where we've chronicled the story of our activisms. And we need support to be able to tell that story in our own words, so that we can learn lessons from the journeys, but also so that we contribute to her story.
My name is Martha Tolana. I'm with the International Community of Women Living with HIV in Zimbabwe, ICW Zimbabwe. I think the women's movement has some key successes which I find in terms of resilience, which I think is very important. Resilience, there have been many challenges, but the women's movement has been resilient, is still around. With the many drawbacks, people still pull together and they make big strides. So, and that the fact that it still exists, and also in general we see a number of milestones that make sure, particularly the one that happened today with the launch of the A Beautiful Strength, the journal. For me, it's one of those examples that shows the resilience and also the pulling together to say no matter what challenges we have, no matter what differences we have, we can still work together. Now, in terms of the challenges or failures that I may find is that sometimes we haven't been able to have the difficult conversations around attitudes and also challenging patriarchal structures and sometimes we are guilty of maintaining these structures. But I think despite these challenges, we are still getting there. In terms of my recommendations moving forward, I think is to continue conversations, to continue supporting the women, bringing in women from the community, from diverse backgrounds. We know that women are across all structures. We have women in academia, we have women who are professionals in different settings, we have women at the grassroots who are doing a lot of work. They need to be brought in and their voices heard within the movement. And we need to be mindful to always make sure that we are not leaving anyone behind. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Commissioner Mshonga, and I'm now working with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And I was with the women's movement for a very long time, about 10 years. The key successes of the women's movement during my period, the 10 years I was there, were firstly building the Women's Coalition to become a national organization that was bringing women together around Zimbabwe. And secondly, I think our next success was really getting to network and connect with women in parliament, the Women's Parliamentary Caucus, women in the church, women farmers, women in the rural areas. In the end, we formed the Rural Women Association. So that was also a success. So we were a movement working interconnected with other movements around the country. That was a huge success. And another success also included campaigning successfully for the Domestic Violence Act that was enacted in 2006. And then everyone thought
the government was not introducing policy, but as women we managed to make that a success. And our other success also was to participate very actively in the constitution making process. We managed to sneak into that process, we managed to lead the process, and I remember very well that our contributions were listened to, our contributions were included, and we protested every step of the way that this happens. And in the end we had a constitution that is very gender sensitive. And I remember on the day when the constitution was signed into law, when it was accepted, the chairpersons called us the following morning to a breakfast meeting to just talk about what had happened and to celebrate what had happened. So I think as we stand now, the women's movement is at a very good point to continue building on the successes and on the momentum that is already there. Everyone is accepted, there is need for gender equality, there is need to uplift women, so we need to continue the struggle. For me, my key recommendation is we need sustained support for the women's movement in Zimbabwe. The donor community, from what I see, they are not giving enough resources to the women. So we need to explore how we can get more resources, even to society, the women's movement, to continue with the struggle. And I think we also need, as women, to continue including every one of us in the struggle. Not only women in the civil rights movement, but women in the political parties, women in the church, women in the education system, academics. So all of us, we need to be working together and not discriminate ourselves, because the problems we face are just the same. So those are really my two recommendations. And obviously the documentation. We need to be very active in encouraging the documentation process so people can see what we have been doing.
Organizations meet regularly, support each other intergenerationally and from urban and rural, within the urban and rural areas. So people are discussing across a broad platform. Don't expect to do too much too quickly, but keep doing as much as you can within your own particular area. Share it, strategize, and keep records and work with the Women's University or some record-keeping organization so that these records are not lost.
I'm Caroline Matija. I'm the technical advisor with the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, and I've been director for gender in the Ministry of Women Affairs, Gender and Community Development. Basically, I think the women's movement in Zimbabwe has made major achievements which we need to celebrate, and key among them was the new constitution, which has an extensive Bill of Rights, and also which has birthed the Zimbabwe Gender Commission. We need to build the young women's movement in Zimbabwe. We need really to make sure that we capacitate and role model the young women to get to know where we came from and also to continue fighting the struggle. Thank you.
So my name is Tsimaraze. I'm a development consultant and organizational development practitioner, but I'm also a very serious gender activist, and my passion is about human relationships, making them work for the benefit of everybody, because we're all created equal in God's image. I effectively joined the women's movement in the early 2000s, and since then I've seen the movement really growing. And for me, some of the major highlights about this movement relate to the ability of women to coalesce around strategic gender issues, spanning from gender-based violence, increasingly to working with women and girls and really working through women's economic and social empowerment, which also touches into the issues of health. And I think as a movement, we've first and foremost managed to bring issues to bear, social issues. We've managed to put them on the calendar so that among ourselves we can have conversations about what is meaningful personal development for a woman, take into account their roles and responsibility, whether they are constructed by society or even relating to the whole issues of choice or agency. So in my own personal view, I think that the fact that we're talking about development, and we're actually having quite a number of women's organizations now, for me it bears testimony to the ability of women to take up their own issues and really make noise about them from an advocacy and lobby perspective, but also from a resource perspective, where we actually have managed to mobilize resources for different causes that relate to issues that pertain to women. And by the way, as women, we don't just deal with issues that affect us as individuals, but we carry with us the whole family, which I would call a constituency. So it begins with me, and also I take into account our children, our spouses, our family, whatever the case might be. So this is why you find in our mix and in our diversity as the Women's Coalition, we actually have different women's organizations which might seemingly be pushing the same agenda and trying to address them in similar ways, targeting maybe the same constituency, but we're also different. And this is where some of the challenges actually pertain. Because I think funding partners do not necessarily at times see the difference. They argue that at times women's organizations are a bottomless pit because we give money but we don't see the results. It is also very difficult, I think, to apportion results to an individual's initiative or an organization's initiative, because the issues that we're dealing with are actually issues that relate to how society behaves and their attitudes towards the same issues. So to that extent, the biggest challenge has been to actually, I think, claim the space for women, claim the space for the issues, and also get resources for it. To the extent that increasingly in the recent years, also because of the economic downturn in the country, we're actually realizing that with limited resources, quite a lot of good causes are actually falling away because there's no funding. And therefore the biggest challenge relates even to the sustainability of some of these organizations that are actually pushing these agendas, to the extent that we have actually lost quite a lot of momentum around topical issues, for example, around child abuse or women's abuse or even gender-based violence, because there's no more funding for that. And yet, if you really look at it, each and every one of us are affected. Because what affects you as a man, if I'm in relationship with you, equally affects me. But people don't necessarily put money to those issues because, for example, human rights discourse or even women's rights, they're very difficult to prove results for. And yet, if you look at the funding system or mechanisms, they rely more on demonstration of results as a basis to get those resources. So as long as you cannot prove with some degree of certainty, with some evidence, it has increasingly become very difficult to get the necessary resources to finance all these initiatives. And therefore my recommendations is that we all need to begin to relate as human beings. We need to start to appreciate what has gone wrong in our relationships. Because fundamentally the work of the women's movement relates and resonates around relationships. And as long as we don't value each other as human beings that have equal say around issues, I think we will not go very far. Secondly, I think we also need to reframe the funding mechanisms to get some of those issues resourced. Because as long as we try to put things in boxes, and if an issue doesn't belong to a particular box and it doesn't get funded, we lose the momentum. And this is actually the challenge that we have. To the extent that if you look at how people are competing, mainstream organizations and women's organizations, the bottom line is that people would rather fund things that are easy, what I call easy, because maybe they're easier to prove results for, such as sinking balls, compared to actually addressing issues of violence. Violence against children and violence against women. So I think we all need to sit together at a table and have these conversations so that at the end of the day, we're actually reframing and coming up with the modalities and frameworks that actually work for everyone's dignity. Thank you.
I'm Loga Idzano. I'm a gender activist. I'm chair of Envision Women's Trust, and I'm also an academic. I'm a professor of sociology. The successes are that there's a general acceptance of women and their activism and the issues that they raise and their validity. I think that is now accepted. The challenge is, of course, that it's very hard for people to change the way they think and the way they speak and the way they talk, and to also challenge their interests, because people are invested in the subordination of women, because they benefit from women's labor, women's incomes, and from exercising power over women. So that is something that is going to be difficult to dislodge. And of course, in terms of the future, I think we have to keep the dialogues going. We have to also empower women so that they can fight for themselves, because right now we're depending on the state, we're depending on other entities to nudge things along, to change the laws and so forth, but we still have to change people. And of course, changing people is about ensuring that women have access to opportunities, resources, and everything that can make their lives empowered. So I think that is the most important part of the struggle, to have the women take charge, take things in their hands, and advocate for themselves so that their situations improve.
My name is Margaret Murewa. I'm a retired actually. I'm a gender activist, but in terms of employment, I'm currently retired. I've worked with women at the grassroots level, national level, regional level, as well as international level. I've been an international activist. What I've seen in the women's movement in Zimbabwe is actually when I started actually as part of the women's movement in the 70s, there were elements of fragmentation between educated women and uneducated women. And then when I started, actually it was just after the first women's conference in Mexico, the UN Women's Conference, the very first one in 1975. And then we're still actually not independent yet. But our challenge actually was to see how this globalized nature of the women's movement could be actually communicated here. In terms of women understanding that the struggles that they were going through were not their own struggles, but they were they had like a global aspect they could relate to. But in our case, actually, we also had an additional element, that of women being second-class citizens in their own country. So we had to deal with that issue as a first entry point in preparation of the advent of independence. At that time, actually, we had women in the struggle, in the trenches, fighting the war. So we had to actually work out how we could embrace each other as women in the post-independence era and define actually what our issues were. And then come independence, actually, I've seen actually most of the issues, at least some of the issues actually being addressed in the political scenario. But even then, actually, the women's movement remained actually fragmented, actually, as partly we had the educated women, those that people termed feminists, who the fragmentation actually, I would like to explain, did not occur as a result of the women themselves, but the perception that actually was made by certain people who were trying to down the women's movement, who actually identified the more educated women, particularly those who were single, as feminists and pushing Western agendas that were not part of the local grassroots actually aspirations of women. But what I've seen actually is the change of that. Women actually becoming women and understanding their struggles as women actually. The other thing I have seen, initially we didn't have the kind of specialization that I've seen evolved. Like we now have media women as activists, legal practitioners as gender activists, and people in different actually professional scenarios are putting in elements of activism in their own private and professional aspects, which actually I saw actually being part of the gathering here. The documentation actually of all that information, particularly by women who've been activists for a long time, I think to me is very, very important, and is a starting point actually for bringing the past into the present and seeing how the past actually has influenced trends in the present, and also allowing actually the younger women to look at exactly what has been achieved so far and taking that further down the line. And what I'm hoping so actually is for the documentation process to continue and spread actually to different areas actually of the feminist engagements, so that the younger generation actually benefits. And also even those people who have been sort of like anti-feminism, to be educated actually and understand that, you know, feminism is part of development, enhancing actually the status of women, not only women in society, but also the contribution women in the development actually scenarios in a way that actually benefits the country and future trends in development in the country. And not forgetting that women actually constitute more than 50% of the population, and the potential that they have in contribution to development is immense. And that actually to happen, actually need to have their voices heard and also their issues actually raised and addressed, so that actually that potential can be realized as part of a force that will propel our country.